Chapter 26. A disagreeable accident happens to me in the discharge of my office. Morgan's nose is offended. A dialogue between him and the ship's steward. Upon examination, I find more causes of complaint than one. My hair is cut off. Morgan's cookery. The manner of sleeping on board. I am waked in the night by a dreadful noise. I could not comprehend how it was possible for the attendants to come near those who hung on the inside towards the sides of the ship, in order to assist them, as they seemed barricaded by those who lay on the outside, and entirely out of the reach of all visitation. Much less could I conceive how my friend Thompson would be able to administer clysters, that were ordered for some, in that situation. When I saw him thrust his wig in his pocket, and strip himself to his waistcoat in a moment, then creep on all fours under the hammocks of the sick, and forcing up his bare pate between two, keep them asunder with one shoulder, until he had done his duty. Eager to learn the service, I desired he would give me leave to perform the next operation of that kind. And he consenting, I undressed myself after his example, and crawling along, the ship happened to roll. This motion alarming me, I laid hold of the first thing that came within my grasp with such violence that I overturned it, and soon found, by the smell that issued upon me, that I had unlocked a box of the most delicious perfume. It was well for me that my nose was none of the most delicate, else I know not how I might have been affected by this vapor, which diffused itself all over the ship, to the utter discomposure of everybody who tarried on the same dock. Neither was the consequence of this disgrace confined to my sense of smelling only, for I felt my misfortune more ways than one. That I might not, however, appear altogether disconcerted in this my first essay, I got up, and pushing my head with great force between two hammocks, towards the middle, where the greatest resistance was, I made an opening indeed, but not understanding the knack of dexterously turning my shoulder to maintain my advantage, had the mortification to find myself stuck up, as it were, in a pillory, and the weight of 3 or 4 people bearing on each side of my neck, so that I was in danger of strangulation. While I remained in this defenseless posture, one of the sick men, rendered peevish by his distemper, was so enraged at the smell I had occasioned and the rude shock he had received from me in my elevation, that with many bitter reproaches he seized me by the nose, which he tweaked so unmercifully that I roared with anguish. Thompson, perceiving my condition, ordered one of the waiters to my assistance, who, with much difficulty, disengaged me from this situation, and hindered me from taking vengeance on the sick man, whose indisposition would not have screened him from the effects of my indignation. After having made an end of our ministry for that time, we descended to the cockpit, my friend comforting me for what had happened with a homely proverb, which I do not choose to repeat. When we had descended halfway down the ladder, Mr. Morgan, before he saw us, having intelligence by his nose of the approach of something extraordinary, cried, "God have mercy upon my senses! I believe the enemy has ported us in a stink pot." Then, directing his discourse to the steward, from whence he imagined the odor proceeded, he reprimanded him severely for the freedoms he took among gentlemen of birth, and threatened to smoke him like a padger with sulphur, if ever he should presume to offend his neighbors with such smells for the future. The steward, conscious of his own innocence, replied with some warmth, "I know of no smells but those of your own making." This repartee introduced a smart dialogue, in which the Welshman undertook to prove that though the stench he complained of did not flow from the steward's own body, he was nevertheless the author of it, by serving out damaged provisions to the ship's company, and in particular putrefied cheese, from the use of which only, he affirmed, such unsavory steams could arise. Then he launched out into the praise of good cheese, of which he gave the analysis, explained the different kinds of that commodity, with the methods practiced to make and preserve it, concluded in observing that, In yielding good cheese, the county of Glamorgan might vie with Cheshire itself, and was much superior to it in the produce of goats and putter. I gathered from this conversation that, if I entered in my present pickle, I should be no welcome guest, and therefore desired Mr. Thompson to go before and represent my calamity, at which the first mate, expressing some concern, went upon deck immediately, taking his way through the cable tier and the main hatchway to avoid encountering me, desiring me to clean myself as soon as possible, for he intended to regale himself with a dish of salmagundy and a pipe. Accordingly, I set about this disagreeable business, and soon found I had more causes of complaint than I at first imagined, for I perceived some guests had honored me with their company, whose visit I did not think seasonable. Neither did they seem inclined to leave me in a hurry, for they were in possession of my chief quarters, where they fed without reserve at the expense of my blood. But considering it would be easier to extirpate the ferocious colony in the infancy of their settlement, than after they should be multiplied and naturalized to the soil, I took the advice of my friend, who, to prevent such misfortunes, went always close-shaved, and made the boy of our mess cut off my hair, which had been growing since I left the service of lavement, and the second mate lent me an old bobwig to supply the loss of that covering. This affair being ended, and everything adjusted in the best manner my circumstances would permit, the descendant of Caractacus returned, and ordering the boy to bring a piece of salt beef from the brine, cut off a slice, and mixed it with an equal quantity of onions, which seasoning with a moderate proportion of pepper and salt, he brought it to a consistence with oil and vinegar. Then, tasting the dish, assured us it was the best salmagundy that ever he made, and recommended it to our palate with such heartiness that I could not help doing honor to his preparation. But I had no sooner swallowed a mouthful than I thought my entrails were scorched, and endeavored with a deluge of small beer to allay the heat it occasioned. Supper being over, Mr. Morgan, having smoked a couple of pipes, and supplied the moisture he had expended with as many cans of flip, of which we all partook, a certain yawning began to admonish me that it was high time to repair by sleep the injury I had suffered from want of rest the preceding night, which being perceived by my companions, whose time of repose was now arrived, they proposed we should turn in, or in other words, go to bed. Our hammocks, which hung parallel to one another on the outside of the berth, were immediately unlashed, and I beheld my messmates spring with great agility into their respective nests, where they seemed to lie concealed, very much at their ease. But it was some time before I could prevail upon myself to trust my carcase at such a distance from the ground, in a narrow bag, out of which, I imagined, I should be apt, on the least motion in my sleep, to tumble down at the hazard of breaking my bones. I suffered myself, however, to be persuaded, and taking a leap to get in, threw myself quite over with such violence that had I not luckily got hold of Thompson's hammock, I should have pitched upon my head on the other side, and in all likelihood fractured my skull. After some fruitless efforts, I succeeded at last, but the apprehension of the jeopardy in which I believed myself withstood all the attacks of sleep till towards the morning watch, when, in spite of my fears, I was overpowered with slumber, though I did not long enjoy this comfortable situation, being aroused with a noise so loud and shrill that I thought the drums of my ears were burst by it. This was followed by a dreadful summons pronounced by a hoarse voice, which I could not understand. While I was debating with myself whether or not I should wake my companion and inquire into the occasion of this disturbance, I was informed by one of the quartermasters who passed by me with a lantern in his hand, that the noise which alarmed me was occasioned by the boatswain's mates who called up the larboard watch, and that I must lay my account with such an interruption every morning at the same hour. Being now more assured of my safety, I undressed myself again to rest, and slept till 8 o'clock, when rising and breakfasting with my comrades on biscuit and brandy, the sick were visited and assisted as before. After which visitation my good friend Thompson explained and performed another piece of duty, to which I was a stranger. At a certain hour in the morning, the boy of the mess went round all the decks, ringing a small handbell, and, in rhymes composed for the occasion, invited all those who had sores to repair before the mast, where one of the doctor's mates attended, with applications to dress them. Chapter 27. I acquire the friendship of the surgeon, who procures a warrant for me and makes me a present of clothes. A battle between a midshipman and me. The surgeon leaves the ship. The captain comes on board with another surgeon. A dialogue between the captain and Morgan. The sick are ordered to be brought upon the quarterdeck and examined. The consequences of that order. A madman accuses Morgan and is set at liberty by command of the captain, whom he instantly attacks and pummels without mercy while I was busied with my friend in the practice. The doctor chanced to pass by the place where we were, and stopping to observe me appeared very well satisfied with my application, and afterwards sent for me to his cabin, where, having examined me touching my skill in surgery and the particulars of my fortune, he interested himself so far in my behalf as to promise his assistance in procuring a warrant for me, seeing I had already been found qualified at surgeon's hall for the station I filled on board. And in this good office he the more cordially engaged when he understood I was nephew to Lieutenant Bowling, for whom he expressed a particular regard. In the meantime, I could learn from his discourse that he did not intend to go to sea again with Captain Oakham, having, as he thought, been indifferently used by him during the last voyage. While I lived tolerably easy, in expectation of preferment, I was not altogether without mortifications, which I not only suffered from the rude insults of the sailors and petty officers, among whom I was known by the name of Loblolly Boy, but also from the disposition of Morgan, who, though friendly in the main, was often very troublesome with his pride, which expected a good deal of submission from me, and delighted in recapitulating the favors I had received at his hands. About 6 weeks after my arrival on board, the surgeon, bidding me to follow him into his cabin, presented a warrant to me, by which I was appointed surgeon's third mate on board the Thunder. This he had procured by his interest at the Navy Office, as also another for himself, by virtue of which he was removed into a second rate. But his generosity rested not here, for before he left the ship he made me a present of a chest and some clothes that enabled me to support the rank to which he had raised me. I found my spirit revive with my good fortune, and now I was an officer, resolved to maintain the dignity of my station against all opposition or affronts, nor was it long before I had occasion to exert my resolution. My old enemy, the midshipman, whose name was Crampley, entertaining an implacable animosity against me for the disgrace he had suffered on my account, had since that time taken all opportunities of reviling and ridiculing me, when I was not entitled to retort this bad usage. And even after I had been rated on the books and mustered as surgeon's mate, did not think fit to restrain his insolence. In particular, being one day present while I dressed a wound in a sailor's leg, he began to sing a song, which I thought highly injurious to the honor of my country, and therefore signified my resentment, by observing that the Scots always laid their account with finding enemies among the ignorant, insignificant, and malicious. This unexpected piece of assurance enraged him to such a degree that he lent me a blow on the face, which I verily thought had demolished my cheekbone. I was not slow in returning the obligation, and the affair began to be very serious, when by accident Mr. Morgan and one of the master's mates, coming that way, interposed, and inquiring into the cause, endeavored to promote a reconciliation. But finding us both exasperated to the uttermost, and bent against accommodation, they advised us either to leave our difference undecided, till we should have an opportunity of terminating it on shore, like gentlemen, or else choose a proper place on board, and bring it to an issue by boxing. The last expedient was greedily embraced by us both, and being forthwith conducted to the ground proposed, we stripped in a moment, and began a furious contest, in which I soon found myself inferior to my antagonist, not so much in strength and agility, as in skill, which he had acquired in the school of Hockley in the Hole at Tottenham Court. Many cross buttocks did I sustain, and pegs on the stomach without number, till at last my breath being quite gone, as well as my vigor wasted, I grew desperate, and collecting all my strength in one effort, threw in at once head, hands, and feet with such violence that I drove my antagonist 3 paces backward into the main hatchway, down which he fell, and pitching upon his head and right shoulder, remained without sense and motion. Morgan, looking down, and seeing him lie in that condition, cried, "Upon my conscience, as I am a Christian sinner, look you, I believe his paddles are all over. But I take you all to witness that there was no treachery in the case, and that he has suffered by the chance of war." So saying, he descended to the deck below, to examine into the situation of my adversary, and left me very little pleased with my victory, as I found myself not only terribly bruised, but likewise in danger of being called to account for the death of Crampley. But this fear vanished when my fellow-mate having, by bleeding him in the jugular, brought him to himself, and inquired into the state of his body, called up to me to be under no concern. For the midshipman had received no other damage than as pretty a luxation of the os humeri as one would desire to see on a summer's day. Upon this information I crawled down to the cockpit, and acquainted Thompson with the affair, who, providing himself with bandages, etc., necessary for the occasion, went up to assist Mr. Morgan in the reduction of the dislocation. When this was successfully performed, they wished me joy of the event of the combat, and the Welshman, after observing that, in all likelihood, the ancient Scots and Britons were the same people, bade me praise Cot for putting metal in my pelly and strength in my limbs to support it. I acquired such reputation by this rencontre, which lasted 20 minutes, that everybody became more cautious in behavior towards me, though Crampley, with his arm in a sling, talked very high, and threatened to seize the first opportunity of retrieving on shore the honor he had lost by an accident, from which I could justly claim no merit. About this time, Captain Oakham, having received sailing orders, came on board and brought along with him a surgeon of his own country, who soon made us sensible of the loss we suffered in the departure of Dr. Atkins. For he was grossly ignorant, and intolerably assuming, false, vindictive, and unforgiving, a merciless tyrant to his inferiors, an abject sycophant to those above him. In the morning after the captain came on board, our first mate, according to custom, went await on him with a sick list, which, when this grim commander had perused, he cried with a stern countenance, "Blood and cons. 61 sick people on board of my ship." "Hark ye, you sir, I'll have no sick in my ship, by G.D., the Welshman replied. He should be very glad to find no sick people on board, but while it was otherwise, he did no more than his duty in presenting him with a list. "You and your list may be D.N.'d," said the captain, throwing it at him. "I say there shall be no sick in this ship while I have the command of her." Mr. Morgan, being nettled at this treatment, told him his indignation ought to be directed to Cot Almighty, who visited his people with distempers, and not to him, who contributed all in his power towards their cure. The Bashaw, not being used to such behavior in any of his officers, was enraged to fury at this satirical insinuation, and, stamping with his foot, called him insolent scoundrel, threatening to have him pinioned to the deck if he should presume to utter another syllable. But the blood of Caractacus, being thoroughly heated, disdained to be restricted by such a command, and began to manifest itself in, "Captain Oakham, I am a gentleman of birth and parentage, look you, and peradventure I am moreover." Here his harangue was broken off by the captain's steward, who, being Morgan's countryman, hurried him out of the cabin before he had time to exasperate his master to a greater degree, and this would certainly have been the case, for the indignant Welshman could hardly be hindered by his friend's arguments and entreaties from re-entering the presence chamber, and defying Captain Oakham to his teeth. He was, however, appeased at length, and came down to the berth, where, finding Thompson and me at work preparing medicines, he bade us leave off our lapper to go to play. For the captain, by his sole word, and power and command, had driven sickness a-pegging to the Tevil, and there was no more malady on board. So saying, he drank off a gill of brandy, sighed grievously 3 times, poured forth an ejaculation of "Cot bless my heart, liver, and lungs," and then began to sing a Welsh song with great earnestness of visage, voice, and gesture. I could not conceive the meaning of this singular phenomenon, and saw by the looks of Thompson, who at the same time shook his head, that he suspected poor Cadwallader's brains were unsettled. He, perceiving our amazement, told us he would explain the mystery, but at the same time bade us take notice that he had lived poy, patcheller, married man, and widower, almost 40 years, and in all that time there was no man, nor mother's son in the whole world who durst use him so ill as Captain Oakham had done. Then he acquainted us with the dialogue that passed between them, as I have already related it, and had no sooner finished this narration than he received a message from the surgeon to bring the sick list to the quarter-deck, for the captain had ordered all the patients thither to be reviewed. This inhuman order shocked us extremely, as we knew it would be impossible to carry some of them on the deck, without imminent danger of their lives. But, as we likewise knew it would be to no purpose for us to remonstrate against it, we repaired to the quarter-deck in a body, to see this extraordinary muster, Morgan observing by the way that the captain was going to send to the other world a great many evidences to testify against himself. When we appeared upon deck, the captain bade the doctor, who stood bowing at his right hand, look at these lazy, lubberly sons of bitches, who were good for nothing on board but to eat the king's provision and encourage idleness in the skulkers. The surgeon grinned approbation, and, taking the list, began to examine the complaints of each as they could crawl to the place appointed. The first who came under his cognizance was a poor fellow just freed of a fever, which had weakened him so much that he could hardly stand. Mr. Macshane, for that was the doctor's name, having felt his pulse, protested he was as well as any man in the world, and the captain delivered him over to the boatswain's mate, with orders that he should receive a round dozen at the gangway immediately, for counterfeiting himself sick. But before the discipline could be executed, the man dropped down on the deck, and had well-nigh perished under the hands of the executioner. The next patient to be considered labored under a quartan ague, and being then in his interval of health, discovered no other symptoms of distemper than a pale, meagre countenance and emaciated body, upon which he was declared fit for duty, and turned over to the boatswain, but being resolved to disgrace the doctor, died upon the forecastle next day, during his cold fit. The third complained of a pleuritic stitch, and spitting of blood, for which Dr. Macshane prescribed exercise at the pump to promote expectoration. But whether this was improper for one in his situation, or that it was used to excess, I know not. But in less than half an hour, he was suffocated with a deluge of blood that issued from his lungs. A fourth, with much difficulty, climbed to the quarterdeck, being loaded with a monstrous ascites or dropsy that invaded his chest so much, he could scarce fetch his breath. But his disease being interpreted into fat, occasioned by idleness and excess of eating, he was ordered, with a view to promote perspiration and enlarge his chest, to go aloft immediately. It was in vain for this unwieldy wretch to allege his utter incapacity. The boatswain's driver was commanded to whip him up with the cat o' nine tails. The smart of this application made him exert himself so much that he actually arrived at the puttock shrouds. But when the enormous weight of his body had nothing else to support than his weakened arms, either out of spite or necessity, he quitted his hold and plunged into the sea, where he must have been drowned, had not a sailor, who was in a boat alongside, saved his life, by keeping him afloat till he was hoisted on board by a tackle. It would be tedious and disagreeable to describe the fate of every miserable object that suffered by the inhumanity and ignorance of the captain and surgeon, who so wantonly sacrificed the lives of their fellow creatures. Many were brought up in the height of fevers, and rendered delirious by the injuries they received in the way. Some gave up the ghost in the presence of their inspectors, and others, who were ordered to their duties, languished a few days at work among their fellows, and then departed without any ceremony. Morgan bore him, and that he was as much in his senses as any man aboard. This was confirmed by the evidence of one of the waiters, who declared he had pulled this patient from the doctor's mate, whom he had gotten down and almost strangled. To this the man answered that the witness was a creature of Morgan's, and suborned to give his testimony against him by the malice of the mate, whom the defendant had affronted by discovering to the people on board that Mr. Morgan's wife kept a gin shop in Ragfair. We did not think fit to disregard his caution, and accordingly got up on the poop, whence we beheld the maniac, as soon as he was released, fly at the captain like a fury, crying, "I'll let you know, you scoundrel, that I am commander of this vessel," and pummel him without mercy. The surgeon, who went to the assistance of his patron, shared the same fate, and it was with the utmost difficulty that he was mastered at last, after having done great execution among those who opposed him. The captain, enraged, threatens to put the madman to death with his own hand, is diverted from that resolution by the arguments and persuasion of the first lieutenant and surgeon. We set sail for St. Helens, join the fleet under the command of Sir C. O. Glee, and proceed for the West Indies, are overtaken by a terrible tempest. My friend Jack Ratlin has his leg broke by a fall from the mainyard. The behavior of Mr. Morgan, finding there was no more damage done, could not help discovering by his countenance the pleasure he enjoyed on this occasion, and while he bathed the doctor's face with an embrocation, ventured to ask him whether he thought there were more fools or madmen on board. Meanwhile, we weighed anchor, and on our way to the Downs, the madman, who was treated as a prisoner, took an opportunity, while the sentinel attending him was at the head, to leap and frustrate the revenge of the captain. Helens in the Grand Fleet, bound for the West Indies, on the ever-memorable expedition of Carthagena. It was not without great mortification I saw myself on the point of being transported to such a distant and unhealthy climate, destitute of every convenience that could render such a voyage supportable, and under the dominion of an arbitrary tyrant, whose command was almost intolerable. However, as these complaints were common to a great many on board, I resolved to submit patiently to my fate and contrive to make myself as easy as the nature of the case would allow. We got out of the channel with a prosperous breeze, which died away, leaving us becalmed about 50 leagues to the westward of the Lizard. But this state of inaction did not last long, for next night our main topsail was split by the wind, which in the morning increased to a hurricane. I was awakened by a most horrible din, occasioned by the play of the gun carriages upon the decks above, the cracking of cabins, the howling of the wind through the shrouds, the confused noise of the ship's crew, the pipes of the boatswain and his mates, the trumpets of the lieutenants, and the clanking of the chain pumps. Morgan, who had never been at sea before, turned out in a great hurry, crying, "God have mercy and compassion upon us. I believe we have caught upon the confines of Lucifer and the D.N." While poor Thompson lay quaking in his hammock, putting up petitions to heaven for our safety. The sea was swelled into billows mountain high, on the top of which our ship sometimes hung as if it were about to be precipitated to the abyss below. Morgan and I ran immediately to his assistance and found a splinter of the shin bone thrust by the violence of the fall through the skin. As this was a case of too great consequence to be treated without the authority of the doctor, I went down to his cabin to inform him of the accident, as well as to bring up dressings which we always kept ready prepared. I entered his apartment without any ceremony, and by the glimmering of a lamp, perceived him on his knees before something that very much resembled a crucifix. But this I will not insist upon, that I may not seem too much a slave to common report, which indeed assisted my conjecture on this occasion, by representing Dr. Macshane as a member of the Church of Rome. Be this as it will, he got up in a sort of confusion, occasioned, I suppose, by his being disturbed in his devotion, and in a trice snatched the subject of my suspicion from my sight. After making an apology for my intrusion, I acquainted him with the situation of Ratlin, but could by no means prevail upon him to visit him on deck, where he lay. He bade me desire the boatswain to order some of the men to carry him down to the cockpit, and in the meantime, said he, I will direct Thompson to get ready the dressings. This piece of information did not at all contribute to my peace of mind. However, as my friend Ratlin complained very much, with the assistance of Morgan I supported him to the lower deck, whither Mr. Macshane, after much entreaty, ventured to come, attended by Thompson, with a box full of dressings, and his own servant, who carried a whole set of capital instruments. He examined the fracture and the wound, and concluding, from a livid color extending itself upon the limb, that mortification would ensue, resolved to amputate the leg immediately. Is there no remedy, doctor? Must I be docked? Can't you splice it? Assuredly, Dr. Macshane, said the first mate, with submission and deference and veneration to your superior abilities and opportunities and stations, look you, I do apprehend and conjure and aver that there is no occasion nor necessity to smite off this poor man's leg. God Almighty bless you, dear Welshman, cried Ratlin. May you have fair wind and weather wheresoever you're bound, and come to an anchor in the road of heaven at last. Macshane, very much incensed at his mates differing in opinion from him, so openly answered that he was not bound to give an account of his practice to him, and in a peremptory tone ordered him to apply the tourniquet. At the sight of which Jack, starting up, cried, "Avast, avast! D. N my heart, if you clap your nippers on me till I know wherefore. Mr. Random, won't you lend a hand towards saving my precious limb?" Odds heart, if Lieutenant Bowling was here, he would not suffer Jack Ratlin's leg to be chopped off like a piece of old junk. This pathetic address to me, joined to my inclination to serve my honest friend, and the reasons I had to believe there was no danger in delaying the amputation, induced me to declare myself of the first mate's opinion, and affirm that the preternatural color of the skin was owing to an inflammation, occasioned by a contusion, and common in all such cases, without any indication of an approaching gangrene. Morgan, who had a great opinion of my skill, manifestly exulted in my fellowship, and asked Thompson's sentiments in the matter, in hopes of strengthening our association with him too. But he, being of a meek disposition, and either dreading the enmity of the surgeon, or speaking the dictates of his own judgment, in a modest manner espoused the opinion of Mackshane, who by this time having consulted with himself, determined to act in such a manner as to screen himself from censure, and at the same time revenge himself on us for our arrogance in contradicting him. With this view, he asked if we would undertake to cure the leg at our peril, that is, be answerable for the consequence. To this question, Morgan replied that the lives of his creatures are at the hands of Cot alone, and it would be great presumption in him to undertake for an event that was in the power of his Maker, no more than the doctor could promise to cure all the sick to whom he administered his assistance. But if the patient would put himself under our direction, we would do our endeavor to bring his distemper to a favorable issue, to which at present we saw no obstruction. I signified my concurrence, and Ratlin was so overjoyed that, shaking us both by the hands, he swore nobody else should touch him, and if he died, his blood should be upon his own head. Mr. Mackshane, flattering himself with the prospect of our miscarriage, went away and left us to manage it as we should think proper. Accordingly, having sawed off part of the splinter that stuck through the skin, we reduced the fracture, dressed the wound, applied the 18-tailed bandage, and put the leg in a box secundum artem. Everything succeeded according to our wish, and we had the satisfaction of not only preserving the poor fellow's leg, but likewise of rendering the doctor contemptible among the ship's company, who had all their eyes on us during the course of this cure, which was completed in 6 weeks. Chapter 29. Mackshane's malice. I am taken up and imprisoned for a spy. Morgan meets with the same fate. Thompson is tampered with to turn evidence against us, disdains the proposal, and is maltreated for his integrity. Morgan is released to assist the surgeon during an engagement with some French ships of war. I remain fettered on the poop, exposed to the enemy's shot, and grow delirious with fear. I'm comforted after the battle by Morgan, who speaks freely of the captain, is overheard by the sentinel, who informs against him, and again imprisoned. Thompson grows desperate, and notwithstanding the remonstrances of Morgan and me, goes overboard in the night. In the meantime, the storm subsided into a brisk gale that carried us into the warm latitudes, where the weather became intolerable and the crew very sickly. The doctor left nothing unattempted towards the completion of his vengeance against the Welshman and me. He went among the sick under pretense of inquiring into their grievances, with a view of picking up complaints to our prejudice. But, finding himself frustrated in that expectation by the goodwill we had procured from the patients by our diligence and humanity, he took the resolution of listening to our conversation, by hiding himself behind the canvas that surrounded our berth. Here, too, he was detected by the boy of our mess, who acquainted us with this piece of behavior, and one night, while we were picking a large bone of salt beef, Morgan discerned something stir on the outside of our hangings, which immediately interpreting to be the doctor, he tipped me the wink and pointed to the place where I could perceive somebody standing. Upon which I snatched up the bone and leveled it with all my force at him, saying, "Whoever you are, take that for your curiosity." It had the desired effect, for we heard the listener tumble down and afterwards crawl to his own cabin. I applauded myself much for this feat, which turned out one of the most unlucky exploits of my life, Makshane, from that time, marking me out for destruction. About a week after this exploit, as I was going my rounds among the sick, I was taken prisoner and carried to the poop by the master-at-arms, where I was loaded with irons, and stapled to the deck, on pretense that I was a spy on board, and had conspired against the captain's life. How ridiculous soever this imputation was, I did not fail to suffer by it all the rigor that could be shown to the worst of criminals, being exposed in this miserable condition to the scorching heat of the sun by day, and the unwholesome damps by night, during the space of 12 days, in which I was neither brought to trial, nor examined touching the probability of the charge. I had no sooner recovered the use of my reflection, which had been quite overthrown by this accident, than I sent for Thompson, who, after condoling me on the occasion, hinted that I owed this misfortune to the hatred of the doctor, who had given an information against me to the captain, in consequence of which I was arrested and all my papers seized. While I was cursing my capricious fate, I saw Morgan ascend the poop, guarded by 2 corporals, who made him sit down by me, that he might be pinioned in the same machine. Notwithstanding my situation, I could scarce refrain from laughing at the countenance of my fellow prisoner, who, without speaking one word, allowed his feet to be enclosed in the rings provided for that purpose. But when they pretended to fasten him on his back, he grew outrageous, and drawing a large caudo from his side pocket, threatened to rip up the belly of the first man that should approach him, in order to treat him in such an unworthy manner. They were prepared to use him very roughly, when the lieutenant on the quarterdeck called up to them to let him remain as he was. He then crept towards me, and taking me by the hand, bade me put my trust in Cott. And looking at Thompson, who sat by us trembling with a pale visage, told him there were 2 more rings for his feet, and he should be glad to find him in such good company. But it was not the intention of our adversary to include the second mate in our fate. Him he expected to be his drudge in attending the sick, and, if possible, his evidence against us. With this view he sounded him afar off, but, finding his integrity incorruptible, harassed him so much out of spite, that in a short time this mild creature grew weary of his life. While I and my fellow prisoner comforted each other in our tribulation, the admiral discovered 4 sail to leeward, and made signal for our ship and 4 more to chase. Hereupon everything was cleared for an engagement, and Makshane, foreseeing he should have occasion for more assistance than one obtained Morgan's liberty, while I was let in this deplorable posture to the chance of battle. It was almost dark when we came up with the sternmost chase, which we hailed, and inquired who they were. They gave us to understand they were French men of war, upon which Captain Oakham commanded them to send their boat on board of him. But they refused, telling him, if he had any business with them, to come on board of their ship. He then threatened to pour in a broadside upon them, which they promised to retain. Both sides were as good as their word, and the engagement began with great fury. The reader may guess how I passed my time, lying in this helpless situation, amidst the terrors of a sea fight, expecting every moment to be cut asunder, or dashed in pieces by the enemy's shot. I endeavored to compose myself as much as possible, by reflecting that I was not a whit more exposed than those who were stationed about me. But when I beheld them employed without intermission in annoying the foe, and encouraged by the society and behavior of one another, I could easily perceive a wide difference between their condition and mine. However, I concealed my agitation as well as I could till the head of the officer of Marines who stood near me, being shot off, bounced from the deck athwart my face, leaving me well-nigh blinded with brains. I could contain myself no longer, but began to bellow with all the strength of my lungs, when a drummer, coming towards me, asked if I was wounded, and before I could answer, received a great shot in his belly, which tore out his entrails, and he fell flat on my breast. This accident entirely bereft me of all discretion. I redoubled my cries, which were drowned in the noise of the battle, and finding myself disregarded, lost all patience, and became frantic. I vented my rage in oaths and execrations, till my spirits, being quite exhausted, I remained quiet, as insensible of the load that oppressed me. The engagement lasted till broad day, when Captain Oakham, finding he was like to gain neither honor nor advantage by the affair, pretended to be undeceived by seeing their colors, and, hailing the ship whom he had fought all night, protested he believed them Spaniards, and the guns being silenced on each side, ordered the barge to be hoisted out, and went on board the French Commodore. Our loss amounted to 10 killed, and 18 wounded, most part of whom afterwards died. My fellow mates had no sooner dispatched their business in the cockpit than, full of friendly concern, they came to visit me. Morgan, ascending first, and seeing my face almost covered with brains and blood, concluded I was no longer a man for this world, and calling to Thompson with great emotion, bade him come up and take his last farewell of his comrade and countryman, who was posted to a better place, where there were no Macshanes nor Oakhams to asperse and torment him. "No," said he, taking me by the hand, "you are going to a country where there is more respect shown to unfortunate gentlemen, and where you will have the satisfaction of beholding your adversaries tossing upon pillows of burning brimstone." Thompson, alarmed at this apostrophe, made haste to the place where I lay, and sitting down by me, with tears in his eyes, inquired into the nature of my calamity. By this time I had recollected myself so far as to be able to converse rationally with my friends, whom, to their great satisfaction, I immediately undeceived with regard to their apprehension of my being mortally wounded. After I had got myself disengaged from the carnage in which I wallowed, and partaken of a refreshment which my friends brought along with them, we entered into discourse upon the hardships we sustained, and spoke very freely of the author of our misery. But our discourse being overheard by the sentinel who guarded me, he was no sooner relieved than he reported to the captain every syllable of our conversation, according to the orders he had received. The effect of this information soon appeared in the arrival of the master-at-arms, who replaced Morgan in his former station, and gave the second mate a caution to keep a strict guard over his tongue, if he did not choose to accompany us in our confinement. Thompson, foreseeing that the whole slavery of attending the sick and wounded, as well as the cruelty of Mackshane, must now fall upon his shoulders, grew desperate at the prospect, and though I never heard him swear before, imprecated dreadful curses on the heads of his oppressors, declaring that he would rather quit life altogether than be much longer under the power of such barbarians. I was not a little startled at his vivacity, and endeavored to alleviate his complaints by representing the subject of my own with as much aggravation as it would bear, by which comparison he might see the balance of misfortune lay on my side, and take an example from me of fortitude and submission, till such time as we could procure redress, which I hoped was not far off, considering that we should probably be in a harbor in less than 3 days, where we should have an opportunity of preferring our complaints to the admiral. The Welshman joined in my remonstrance, and was at great pains to demonstrate that it was every man's duty as well as interest to resign himself to the divine will, and look upon himself as a sentinel upon duty, who is by no means at liberty to leave his post before he is relieved. Thompson listened attentively to what he said, and at last, shedding a flood of tears, shook his hand and left us without making any reply. About 11 at night, he came to see us again with a settled gloom on his countenance, and gave us to understand that he had undergone excessive toil since he saw us, and in recompense had been grossly abused by the doctor, who taxed him with being confederate with us, in a design of taking away his life and that of the captain. After some time spent in mutual exhortation, he got up, and squeezing me by the hand with uncommon fervor, cried, "God bless you both," and left us to wonder at his singular manner of parting with us, which did not fail to make a deep impression on us both. Next morning, when the hour of visitation came round, the unhappy young man was missing, and after strict search, supposed to have gone overboard in the night, and this was certainly the case. Chapter 30. We lament the fate of our companion. The captain offers Morgan his liberty, which he refuses to accept. We are brought before him and examined. Morgan is sent back into custody, whither also I am remanded after a curious trial. The news of this event affected my fellow prisoner and me extremely, as our unfortunate companion had justly acquired by his amiable disposition the love and esteem of us both. And the more we regretted his untimely fate, the greater horror we conceived for the villain who was undoubtedly the occasion of it. This abandoned miscreant did not discover the least symptom of concern for Thompson's death, although he must have been conscious to himself of having driven him by ill usage to the fatal resolution, but desired the captain to set Morgan at liberty again to look after the patients. Accordingly, one of the corporals was sent up to unfetter him, but he protested he would not be released until he should know for what he was confined. Nor would he be a tennis ball, nor a shuttlecock, nor a trudge, nor a scullion to any captain under the sun. Oakham, finding him obstinate, and fearing it would not be in his power to exercise his tyranny much longer with impunity, was willing to show some appearance of justice, and therefore ordered us both to be brought before him on the quarter-deck, where he sat in state, with his cleric on one side and his counselor Maxshane on the other. When we approached, he honored us with this salutation: "So, gentlemen D.N. my blood, many a captain in the Navy would have ordered you both to be tucked up to the yard's arm, without either judge or jury, for the crimes you have been guilty of. But D.N. my blood, I have too much good nature in allowing such dogs as you to make defense." "Captain Oakham," said my fellow sufferer, "certainly it is in your power, caught help the while, to tack us all up at your will, desire, and pleasures." So may the farmer hang his kids for his diversion, and amusement and mirth. But there is such a thing as justice, if not upon earth, surely in heaven, that will punish with fire and brimstone all those who take away the lives of innocent people out of wantonness and barbarity, look you. In the meantime, I shall be glad to know the crimes laid to my charge and see the person who accuses me. "That you shall," said the captain. "Here, doctor, what have you to say?" Maxshane, stepping forward, hemmed a good while in order to clear his throat, and before he began, Morgan accosted him thus: "Dr. Maxshane, look in my face, look in the face of an honest man, who abhors a false witness as he abhors the devil, and caught be judge between you and me." The doctor, not minding this conjuration, made the following speech, as near as I can remember. "I'll tell you what, Mr. Morgan, to be sure what you say is just, in regard to an honest man, and if so be it appears as how you are an honest man, then it is my opinion that you deserve to be acquitted, in relation to that their affair. For I tell you what, Captain Oakham is resolved for to do everybody justice. As for my own part, all that I have to allege is that I have been informed you have spoken disrespectful words against your captain, who, to be sure, is the most honorable and generous commander in the king's service, without asparagement or exception of man, woman, or child. Having uttered this elegant harangue, on which he seemed to plume himself, Morgan replied, I do partly guess and conceive and understand your meaning, which I wish could be more explicit. But however, I do suppose I am not to be condemned upon bare hearsay, or if I am convicted of speaking disrespectfully of Captain Oakham, I hope there is no treason in my words. But there's mutiny by G.D., and that's death by the Articles of War, cried Oakham. In the meantime, let the witnesses be called. Hereupon Macshane's servant appeared, and the boy of our mess, whom they had seduced and tutored for the purpose. The first declared that Morgan, as he descended the cockpit ladder one day, cursed the captain and called him a savage beast, saying he ought to be hunted down as an enemy to mankind. This, said the clerk, is a strong presumption of a design formed against the captain's life. For why? Then the sentinel, who heard our discourse on the poop, was examined, and informed the court that the Welshman assured me Captain Oakham and Dr. Macshane would toss upon billows of burning brimstone in hell for their barbarity. The clerk observed that there was an evident prejudication, which confirmed the former suspicion of a conspiracy against the life of Captain Oakham, because how could Morgan so positively pronounce that the captain and surgeon would end, unless he had intention to make away with them before they could have time to repent? This sage explanation had great weight with our noble commander, who exclaimed, What have you to say to this, Taffy? You seem to be taken all aback, brother, ha? Morgan was too much of a gentleman to disown the text, although he absolutely denied the truth of the comment. Upon which the captain, strutting up to him with a ferocious countenance, said, So, mister, son of a bitch, you confess you honored me with the names of bear and beast, and pronounced my damnation. And my heart. I have a good mind to have you brought to a court-martial and hanged, you dog. Here Macshane, having occasion for an assistant, interposed, and begged the captain to pardon Mr. Morgan with his wonted goodness, upon condition that he the delinquent should make such submission as the nature of his misdemeanor demanded. Upon which the Cambro Briton, who on this occasion would have made no submission to the great mogul, surrounded with his guards, thanked the doctor for his mediation, and acknowledged himself in the wrong for calling the image of cod a piece. But, said he, I spoke by metaphor and parable and comparison and types, as we signify meekness by a lamb, lechery by a goat, and craftiness by a fox. So we liken ignorance to an ass, and brutality to a bear, and fury to a tiger. Therefore I made use of these similes to express my sentiments, look you, and what I said before caught, I will not unsay before man nor beast neither. Oakham was so provoked at this insolence, as he termed it, that he ordered him forthwith to be carried to the place of his confinement, and his clerk to proceed on the examination of me. The first question put to me was touching the place of my nativity, which I declared to be the north of Scotland. The north of Ireland more like, cried the captain, but we shall bring you up presently. He then asked what religion I professed, and when I answered the Protestant, swore I was an errant Roman as ever went to mass. Come, clerk, continued he, catechize him a little on this subject. But before I relate the particulars of the clerk's inquiries, it will not be amiss to inform the reader that our commander himself was an Hibernian, and, if not shrewdly belied, a Roman Catholic to boot. "You say you are a Protestant," said the clerk. "Make the sign of the cross with your finger so, and swear upon it to that affirmation." When I was about to perform the ceremony, the captain cried with some emotion, "No, no, me. I'll have no profanation neither. But go on with your interrogations." "Well then," proceeded my examiner, "how many sacraments are there?" To which I replied, 2. "What are they?" said he. I answered, "Baptism and the Lord's Supper." "And so you would explode confirmation and marriage altogether," said Oakham. "I thought this fellow was a rank Roman." The clerk, though he was bred under an attorney, could not refrain from blushing at this blunder, which he endeavored to conceal by observing that these decoys would not do with me, who seemed to be an old offender. He went on with asking if I believed in transubstantiation, but I treated the notion of real presence with such disrespect that his patron was scandalized at my impiety and commanded him to proceed to the plot. Whereupon this miserable pettifogger told me there was great reason to suspect me of being a spy on board, and that I had entered into a conspiracy with Thompson, and others not yet detected, against the life of Captain Oakham, which accusation they pretended to support by the evidence of our boy, who declared he had often heard the deceased Thompson and me whispering together, and could distinguish the words, "Oakham, rascal, poison, pistol," by which expressions it appeared we did intend to use sinister means to accomplish his destruction. That the death of Thompson seemed to confirm this conjecture, who, either feeling the stings of remorse for being engaged in such a horrid confederacy, or fearing a discovery, by which he must have infallibly suffered an ignominious death, had put a fatal period to his own existence. But what established the truth of the whole was a book in ciphers found among my papers, which exactly tallied with one found in his chest after his disappearance. This, he observed, was a presumption very near positive proof, and would determine any jury in Christendom to find me guilty. In my own defense, I alleged that I had been dragged on board at first very much against my inclination, as I could prove by the evidence of some people now in the ship, consequently could have no design of becoming spy at that time, and ever since had been entirely out of the reach of any correspondence that could justly entail that suspicion upon me. As for conspiring against my captain's life, it could not be supposed that any man in his right wits would harbor the least thought of such an undertaking, which he could not possibly perform without certain infamy and ruin to himself, even if he had all the inclination in the world. That, allowing the boy's evidence to be true, which I affirmed was false and malicious, nothing conclusive could be gathered from a few incoherent words, neither was the fate of Mr. Thompson a circumstance more favorable for the charge, for I had in my pocket a letter which too well explained that mystery, in a very different manner from that which was supposed. With these words, I produced the following letter, which Jack Ratlin brought to me the very day after Thompson disappeared, and told me it was committed to his care by the deceased, who made him promise not to deliver it sooner. The clerk, taking it out of my hand, read aloud the contents, which were these: "Dear friend, I am so much oppressed with the fatigue I daily and nightly undergo, and the barbarous usage of Dr. Mackshane, who is bent on your destruction as well as mine, that I am resolved to free myself from this miserable life, and before you receive this shall be no more. I could have wished to die in your good opinion, which I am afraid I shall forfeit by the last act of my life. But if you cannot acquit me, I know you will at least preserve some regard for the memory of an unfortunate young man who loved you. I recommend it to you, to beware of Makshane, whose revenge is implacable. I wish all prosperity to you and Mr. Morgan, to whom pray offer my last respects, and beg to be remembered as your unhappy friend and countryman, William Thompson. This letter was no sooner read than Makshane, in a transport of rage, snatched it out of the clerk's hands and tore it into 1,000 pieces, saying it was a villainous forgery, contrived and executed by myself. The captain and clerk declared themselves of the same opinion, although I insisted of having the remains of it compared with other writings of Thompson, which they had in their possession, and I was ordered to answer the last article of my accusation, namely, the book of ciphers found among my papers. That is easily done, said I. What you are pleased to call ciphers are no other than the Greek characters, in which, for my amusement, I keep a diary of everything remarkable that has occurred to my observation since the beginning of the voyage, till the day in which I was put in irons, and the same method was practiced by Mr. Thompson, who copied mine. A very likely story, cried Makshane. What occasion was there for using Greek characters, if you were not afraid of discovering what you had wrote? But what d'ye talk of Greek characters? D'ye think I am so ignorant of the Greek language as not to distinguish its letters from these, which are no more Greek than Chinese? No, no, I will not give up my knowledge of the Greek for you, nor none that ever came from your country. So saying, with an unparalleled effrontery, he repeated some gibberish, which by the sound seemed to be Irish, and made it pass for Greek with the captain, who, looking at me with a contemptuous sneer, exclaimed, "Ah, ah! Have you caught a Tartar?" I could not help smiling at the consummate assurance of this Hibernian, and offered to refer the dispute to anybody on board who understood the Greek alphabet. Upon which Morgan was brought back, and, being made acquainted with the affair, took the book and read a whole page in English, without hesitation, deciding the controversy in my favor. The doctor was so far from being out of countenance at this detection that he affirmed Morgan was in the secret, and repeated from his own invention. Oakham said, I see they are both in a story," and dismissed my fellow-mate to his cockloft, although I proposed that he and I should read and translate, separately, any chapter or verse in the Greek Testament in his possession, by which it would appear whether we or the surgeon spoke truth. Not being endued with eloquence enough to convince the captain that there could be no juggle nor confederacy in this expedient, I begged to be examined by some unconcerned person on board, who understood Greek. Accordingly, the whole ship's company, officers and all, were called upon deck, among whom it was proclaimed that, if any one of them could speak Greek, he or they so qualified should ascend the quarterdeck immediately. After some pause, 2 foremast men came up, and professed their skill in that language, which, they said, they acquired during several voyages to the Levant, among the Greeks of the Mora. The captain exulted much in this declaration, and put my journal book into the hands of one of them, who candidly owned he could neither read nor write. The other acknowledged the same degree of ignorance, but pretended to speak the Greek lingo with any man on board, and, addressing himself to me, pronounced some sentences of a barbarous, corrupted language, which I did not understand. I asserted that the modern Greek was as different from that spoken and written by the ancients, as the English used now from the old Saxons spoke in the time of Hengist, and as I had only learned the true original tongue, in which Homer, Pindar, the evangelists, and other great men of antiquity wrote, it could not be supposed that I should know anything of an imperfect Gothic dialect that rose on the ruins of the former, and scarce retained any traces of the old expression. But if Dr. Makshane, who pretended to be master of the Greek language, could maintain a conversation with these seamen, I would retract what I had said, and be content to suffer any punishment B should think proper to inflict. I had no sooner uttered these words than the surgeon, knowing one of the fellows to be his countryman, accosted him in Irish, and was answered in the same brogue. Then a dialogue ensued between them, which they affirmed to be in Greek, after having secured the secrecy of the other tar, who had his cue in the language of the Mora, from his companion, before they would venture to assert such an intrepid falsehood. "I thought," said Oakham, "we should discover the imposture at last. Let the rascal be carried back to his confinement. I find he must dangle." Having nothing further to urge in my own behalf, before a court so prejudiced with spite, and fortified with ignorance against truth, I suffered myself to be reconducted peaceably to my fellow prisoner, who, hearing the particulars of my trial, lifted up his hands and eyes to heaven, and uttered a dreadful groan. And not daring to disburden his thoughts to me by speech, lest he might be overheard by the sentinel, burst forth into a Welsh song, which he accompanied with 1,000 contortions of face and violent gestures of body.